Dakota Territory, 1888. While every homesteader raced to throw up walls and nail down puncheon floors before the first freeze, Norwegian carpenter Lars Nilsen was still hammering in late November. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. He'd built a perfectly good floor, 3-inch hand-hewn planks split with a broad axe, then started building a second floor on top of it. Sleepers laid crosswise, cavities packed with dry sawdust, another layer of tight planks nailed down. Everyone else settled for the standard, quick puncheon floors with gaps that let cold air crawl up from the dirt below, stealing heat right at ankle level where families lived. They burned 2 to 3 armloads of wood daily just to stay functional, yet still went numb from the feet up. Lars spent extra nails, extra lumber, extra time when winter was breathing down their necks. Then January 12th arrived. The children's blizzard hit without warning, mild morning to 40 below in hours, wind screaming at 60 miles per hour. Standard cabins turned into ice boxes. Neighbors burned through firewood fighting drafts they couldn't stop. But Lars's cabin stayed warm enough to work without gloves. His ankle-height air measured 52 degrees while his neighbors hit 19. His feet stayed 33 degrees warmer where it mattered most. What did this Norwegian carpenter understand about heat, air movement, and floor construction that seasoned frontier builders dismissed as foreign nonsense? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The laughter started the moment Lars Nilsen began laying out his sleepers. November 23rd, 1888, and most sensible homesteaders were already banking their cabins with earth and checking their firewood stacks. Winter was 6 weeks out, maybe less if the weather turned early, and here was the Norwegian still hammering inside his 16 by 20-foot cabin like he had all the time in the world. Caleb Harlan stopped his own chinking work to watch through the open door. "What in the Sam Hill are you doing in there, Lars?" The question carried across the small cluster of cabins that made up their corner of Dakota Territory, drawing curious looks from the Andersons, the Schmidts, and young Ephraim Cole, who was wrestling with his own roof repairs. Lars didn't look up from his measuring, 1.5-inch by 2-inch strips laid crosswise over the puncheon floor he'd finished just 2 weeks earlier. 12 inches on center, exactly as old Ola Berg had taught him back in Wisconsin. "Making it right," he called back, his accent still thick after 3 years in America. The puncheon floor beneath his feet was solid enough, 3 to 4 inches thick, hand-hewn with broad axe and adze, the kind of serviceable flooring that had sheltered frontier families from Minnesota to Nebraska. But Lars could feel what his neighbors had learned to ignore. The thin streams of cold air that found every gap between the planks, every place where green wood had shrunk, and open seams that ran like invisible rivers across the floor. On a calm day, it was just a draft around your ankles. When the wind picked up, it turned the whole room into a convection system that pulled heat straight up to the ceiling while leaving your feet numb. Inga Nielsen knew the feeling better than anyone. 3 winters of tending their stove. 3 winters of watching her children's breath fog while they sat at the table. 3 winters of burning armload after armload of precious wood while the cold crept up from below like water through a sieve. She'd tried everything the neighbor women suggested. Braided rugs laid thick, loose straw scattered and swept up daily, even banking the exterior foundation with extra earth to cut the wind underneath. Nothing stopped the fundamental problem. Air moved through a puncheon floor like it was designed to, because in a way it was. "You already got a floor, Lars." Caleb's voice carried the patient tone men used when explaining obvious things to stubborn foreigners. "Good solid puncheons. Tear them out later when you can afford sawn lumber from the mill." But Lars had no intention of tearing anything out. He'd learned floor construction from men who built for Norwegian winters, where a drafty floor wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. His father had shown him pugging work when he was still small enough to crawl into tight spaces, packing cavities with whatever dry material would stop air movement, sawdust from the mill, clean straw, even moss when nothing else was available. The principle was older than any of them, trap still air, break the path the cold wanted to take, force heat to travel through multiple barriers instead of racing straight through gaps. The sleepers went down methodically, each one checked with his level, each one secured with cut nails that had cost him 2 days' wages in town. By evening, he had a grid of cavities running the length of his cabin, each bay roughly 12 inches wide and 2 inches deep, ready for the next step that would really set his neighbors talking. The sawdust came from Muller's Mill, 15 miles south. Lars had made the trip twice, loading his wagon with the finest, driest chips he could find, the powder-fine stuff that came off the big circular saw when it bit through seasoned pine. 40 to 50 cubic feet of it, enough to fill every cavity with room to spare. Good sawdust wasn't free, but it was cheaper than the cord after cord of firewood his neighbors burned trying to heat air that leaked away as fast as their stoves could make it. Now I've seen everything. Caleb stood in the doorway, shaking his head as Lars began shoveling sawdust into the first bay. Building a floor on top of a floor, filling it with mill sweepings like some kind of bird's nest. What's next? Putting carpets on your roof. The mockery spread faster than Lars could work. Young Ephraim Cole abandoned his roof entirely to come watch the Norwegian waste good lumber on what everyone could see was perfectly adequate flooring. Mrs. Anderson made pointed comments about immigrants and their peculiar ideas. Even the children started calling it Lars's silly floor, turning it into a neighborhood joke that would follow him through the winter, or so they all assumed. But Inga watched her husband work with different eyes. She'd grown up in a sod house where her mother fought cold with whatever came to hand, and she'd learned to judge methods by results, not opinions. When Lars tamped the sawdust just firm enough to keep it from settling, she saw insulation. When he carefully blocked the perimeter with thin strips and chinking to stop air from racing up the walls, she saw draft control. When he began nailing down the top layer of tight-fitted boards, inch-thick planks he'd ordered special from the mill, she saw a system that might actually work. The hammering continued for 2 full days, morning to evening, while neighbors made their jokes and wondered aloud about the waste of good nails on invisible improvements. 8 to 10 pounds of cut nails, driven through planks that would never be seen again, securing a second floor that covered a first floor that had been perfectly adequate for frontier living. By the time Lars finished, November was nearly gone, and the first serious cold was moving down from Canada. His neighbors had banked their foundations, chinked their walls, and settled in for another winter of burning through firewood while their feet went numb. They'd done what frontier common sense demanded. Roof first, walls tight, hot stove, make do with what you had until better times came. Lars Nielsen had done something different. He'd built as if the cold was already at his door, as if the difference between adequate and right might matter more than anyone wanted to admit. The laughter outside his door would continue for 6 more weeks, right up until the morning when the sky turned white and the wind began to scream. And suddenly, everyone wanted to know exactly how thick those sleepers were, exactly what he'd used for fill, and exactly how he'd managed to make a floor that didn't steal the heat right out from under a family's feet. The key to understanding what Lars Nielsen built required getting underneath his cabin on a cold morning, which nobody wanted to do until the method proved itself. But old Ola Berg had made the journey from Wisconsin specifically to see how his teaching had translated to Dakota Territory construction, and he spent a full hour crawling around the foundation with a lantern, examining the underside of what everyone else dismissed as elaborate foolishness. What Berg found was a textbook example of what carpenters had been calling pugging, or deafening, for longer than anyone could remember. The practice of filling cavities between structural members with whatever dry material would trap still air and deaden sound transmission. The difference was that most builders used the technique in walls or between ceiling joists. Lars had applied it underfoot, where heat loss mattered most to the people actually living in the space. The construction itself was methodical in a way that revealed its European origins. The original puncheon floor remained exactly where Lars had laid it, serving as the structural base for everything above. Those 3 to 4 inch planks, hand-hewn and serviceable, carried the load and provided the foundation for the system above them. Rather than fight the existing floor or try to improve it directly, Lars had simply treated it as the first layer of a more complex assembly. The sleepers ran perpendicular to the puncheons, creating a perfect grid of cavities that could be filled and sealed independently. Each strip measured exactly 1.5 inches by 2 inches, sized to create the optimal depth for insulation without wasting lumber or creating spaces too large to fill properly. The 12-inch spacing followed traditional joist layouts, ensuring that the load from above would distribute evenly across the supporting structure below. But the real innovation lay in how Lars had handled the perimeter, the vulnerable edge where most builders left gaps that turned into thermal highways for cold air. Instead of simply running his sleepers wall to wall and hoping for the best, he'd installed a continuous draft stop around the entire room perimeter. Thin strips of wood, carefully fitted and chinked, created an unbroken seal that forced any air movement to travel through the insulation rather than around it. Ola Berg ran his weathered hands along these edge details, nodding approval at work that showed understanding of how buildings actually failed. "Most men think cold comes through walls," he explained to Lars in their mixture of Norwegian and English. "But cold is like water. It finds the easy path. Under the floor, up through cracks, straight to where people stand." The old joiner had seen too many cabins where families huddled around stoves that heated the ceiling while their feet froze, all because the builders never controlled the air movement at floor level. The sawdust fill represented both practical necessity and accumulated wisdom about what materials actually worked for thermal control. Lars had rejected straw, despite its availability, because straw compressed too easily and left channels where air could move. He'd rejected rags and cloth scraps because they held moisture and created problems with mold and rot. Instead, he'd chosen the finest sawdust he could find, powder-dry material that packed firmly without creating solid mass, trapping thousands of tiny air pockets that served as barriers to heat transfer. The filling process itself required judgment that separated craft knowledge from simple labor. Too loose, and the sawdust would settle over time, leaving gaps at the top of each cavity. Too tight, and it would compress into something closer to solid wood, losing its insulating properties. Lars had learned to tamp it just firm enough to support the weight of the top planks without eliminating the air spaces that made the system work. Each bay took roughly the same amount of material, about 3 to 4 cubic feet of sawdust per 12-inch section. But the real test came at the edges, where the fill met the perimeter strips. Here, Lars used a technique Ola Berg recognized from old country construction. Careful hand packing that sealed every gap without overcompressing the material. The result was a continuous thermal barrier that forced cold air to travel through multiple layers of trapped air, rather than finding easy paths around the insulation. The top planks represented the most expensive part of the entire system, but also the most critical for long-term performance. Lars had ordered inch-thick boards from the mill, paying premium prices for lumber that would never be seen once the cabin was furnished. But these planks served multiple functions beyond simple flooring. They distributed the load from furniture and foot traffic across the entire sleeper system. They provided a smooth, gap-free surface that eliminated the drafts everyone accepted as normal with puncheon floors. Most importantly, they created the final seal that made the insulation system work as designed. The nailing pattern showed the same attention to detail that marked the entire project. Rather than simply face nailing the planks with whatever nails came to hand, Lars had invested in proper cut nails, 8 to 10 pounds of them, sized to penetrate through the top planks, through the sleepers, and into the puncheon base below. Each board was secured every 12 inches with nails driven slightly below the surface and the holes filled with wood putty, creating a floor surface that would remain tight and quiet for years of use. When Ola Berg finally emerged from his inspection, covered in sawdust and cobwebs, his verdict carried the weight of 40 years' experience with Northern European construction methods. "This is how we built in the old country when fuel was dear and winters were long," he announced to the small crowd that had gathered to watch the old man's examination. "Not fancy, not modern, just understanding how heat moves and how to stop it where people live. But understanding the method and appreciating its necessity were different things entirely." Caleb Harlan studied the exposed construction with the skeptical eye of a man who'd built a dozen cabins using time-tested frontier methods. "All that work and lumber for something that goes underfoot," he muttered, calculating the cost of sleepers, sawdust, top planks, and nails. A man could build half a barn with what you spent on flooring nobody sees. The criticism stung because it contained truth that every frontier family understood. Lumber was expensive, nails were precious, and labor was always needed elsewhere, on barns, fences, repairs that everyone could see and judge. Spending resources on invisible improvements felt like luxury when most families were still struggling to establish the basics of frontier life. Yet Lars knew something his neighbors hadn't learned yet, that winter on the Dakota Prairie was different from winter in more settled regions, and that the techniques that worked adequately in milder climates could prove deadly when truly severe weather arrived. The double floor wasn't decoration or immigrant eccentricity, it was preparation for conditions that most American-born settlers had never experienced and hoped they never would. The hammering had stopped, the sawdust was swept clean, and the final floor lay smooth and tight underfoot. Now there was nothing to do but wait for winter to test whether all that extra work, extra lumber, and extra expense would prove worthwhile, or whether the neighbors had been right all along about foreign ideas and unnecessary complications. January 12th, 1888, dawned with temperatures mild enough that children walked to school without heavy coats. Miss Addie Carpenter had taught frontier schools long enough to read weather like a farmer reads soil, but even her experienced eye saw nothing alarming in the pewter-colored sky that stretched from horizon to horizon across Dakota Territory. The barometer in the settlement store held steady, the wind came gentle from the south, and most folks went about their morning chores in shirt sleeves, grateful for what felt like a January thaw. By 10 o'clock, when children should have been reciting their multiplication tables, the sky had begun to change in ways that made Miss Addie step outside her schoolhouse for a longer look. The pewter had deepened to something closer to slate, and the southern breeze that had felt so pleasant at dawn now carried an edge that made her pull her shawl tighter. More troubling was what she couldn't see. The horizon had disappeared behind what looked like a moving fence of white stretching from north to south as far as her eyes could track. The first flakes arrived like scouts, scattered and lazy, melting before they touched the schoolhouse steps. But Miss Addie had seen enough prairie storms to recognize the false calm that preceded the truly dangerous ones. By 10:30, she dismissed school and sent the children running for their homes, hoping they'd reach shelter before the storm showed its true nature. Most of them made it. Some did not, and their names would be remembered long after the storm earned its grim nickname, the Children's Blizzard. The transformation from mild morning to killing weather happened with a speed that caught even experienced settlers unprepared. By noon, the temperature had plunged 30 degrees and was still dropping. The gentle southern breeze had swung to the northwest and built to a howling 60-mile-per-hour gale that drove snow horizontally across the prairie with such force that visibility dropped to arm's length. What had been passable roads at breakfast became impassable death traps by dinner, and the storm was just beginning to show what it could do to the unprepared. Inside his cabin, Lars Nilsson fed his stove and watched the wind test every joint and seam in his construction. The temperature outside was falling toward 40 below zero, and the wind was finding every weakness in buildings throughout the settlement. In cabins built to standard frontier specifications, families huddled close to their stoves and fed them constantly, burning through carefully hoarded firewood at rates that would empty their woodpiles long before spring. The difference between his cabin and his neighbors became apparent within the first few hours of serious cold. In Caleb Harlan's cabin next door, the familiar pattern established itself quickly. The stove heated the air near the ceiling to something approaching comfortable, while cold air poured steadily through the gaps in his puncheon floor, creating the convection currents that every frontier family knew and accepted. Hot air rose, cold air sank, and the result was a room stratified by temperature where a man's head might be warm while his feet slowly froze. Caleb found himself feeding his stove every 30 to 45 minutes, burning through split pine and oak at a rate that made him calculate and recalculate his remaining stores. The fire heated the air, but the air kept moving, up through the warmest zone near the ceiling, then down the walls to be cooled again by contact with the cold surfaces and the steady infiltration from below. His children sat as close to the stove as safety allowed, their breath still visible in the main living area despite the constant burning. But in Lars's cabin, something different was happening. The same type of stove, fed with similar wood, produced a fundamentally different result because the heated air had nowhere to escape at floor level. The double floor acted like a plug in a bathtub, stopping the thermal drain that robbed other cabins of their hard-won heat. Instead of racing away through gaps and cracks, the warm air settled and stayed, creating an environment where the entire room maintained more even temperatures from floor to ceiling. The difference was measurable in ways that mattered to survival. While the air at ankle height in Caleb's cabin dropped to 19 degrees, cold enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes, the same measurement in Lars's cabin read 52 degrees. 33 degrees warmer where families actually lived, where children played on the floor, where women worked at tables, and men sat to repair harness and tools. The floor surface itself told the same story. Caleb's exposed puncheons registered 27 degrees to the touch, while Lars's sealed planks stayed at 42 degrees, 15 degrees warmer under bare or stockinged feet. More importantly, Lars could maintain these temperatures with significantly less fuel. Where his neighbors fed their stoves constantly, fighting the thermal losses they couldn't control, Lars found he could go 60 to 90 minutes between feedings without losing the battle against infiltration. The insulated floor didn't create heat, it simply prevented the loss of heat the stove was already producing, making every split log and every shovel of coal work more efficiently. As afternoon faded to evening and the storm intensified, the implications of these differences became clear. This wasn't a brief cold snap that families could endure by burning extra wood for a few days. The children's blizzard would rage for 3 days and nights, followed by weeks of brutal cold that would test every aspect of frontier construction and preparation. Cabins that lost heat faster than their stoves could replace it would become uninhabitable. Families whose wood piles couldn't sustain the constant burning would face choices between freezing and burning their furniture, their tools, anything that would catch fire. The first knock on Lars's door came just after dark, when the storm had reached its full fury and the temperature outside had fallen to levels that killed exposed flesh in minutes. Caleb Harlan stood on the doorstep with his youngest daughter wrapped in every blanket they owned, her feet blue with cold despite wool stockings and leather boots. "Lars," he said, his voice steady but strained, "we're burning through our wood faster than we can keep warm. The child's feet." He didn't need to finish. Everyone had heard stories of frontier children who lost toes and fingers to cold that parents couldn't fight with inadequate preparation. Behind Caleb came the Andersons, then the Schmidts, then young Ephraim Cole with his pregnant wife, all driven from their own cabins by the simple mathematics of heat loss versus heat production. Their stoves couldn't keep up with the thermal hemorrhaging that turned every BTU into a losing battle against physics and poor construction. The storm had become the test that separated adequate from sufficient, and the neighborhood was learning which category their buildings fell into. Lars's cabin, built for exactly these conditions, welcomed them all. The double floor that had seemed like wasteful immigrant foolishness now revealed its purpose: to create a space where human life could continue comfortably even when the outside world became actively hostile to survival. As families crowded together in the warmth that stayed put instead of bleeding away through 1,000 gaps and cracks, the mockery of November turned into the gratitude of January, and everyone began asking the same questions about sleepers, sawdust, and edge sealing that would change how the settlement built floors from that winter forward. The second night of the blizzard proved what the first had only suggested, that the difference between adequate and right could mean the difference between survival and death when weather turned truly vicious. While wind howled across the prairie at speeds that made venture outdoors impossible, the families crowded into Lars Nilsson's cabin discovered that comfort during a killer storm wasn't just about having a hot stove, it was about keeping the heat where people could use it instead of letting it disappear into the structure of the building itself. Caleb Harlan had built cabins for 15 years across 3 states, and he knew the standard approach to heating as well as any man on the frontier. You built the biggest firebox you could afford, you fed it constantly when the weather turned cold, and you accepted that some parts of the room would be warm while others stayed cold. That was simply how cabins worked: hot near the fire, cold near the walls, Coldest of all at floor level where drafts did their stealing work. A man learned to live with the stratification, to keep his feet off the floor and his chair close to the heat source. But watching Lars tend his stove with casual efficiency while maintaining comfort for 12 people in a space designed for 4, Caleb began to understand that his fundamental assumptions about frontier heating might be incomplete. The difference wasn't in the stove. Both cabins used similar fireboxes fed with the same split oak and pine. The difference was in what happened to the heat after the stove produced it. In Caleb's cabin, now standing empty and rapidly cooling despite the banked coals in his firebox, heat rose to the ceiling and immediately began searching for ways to escape. Some went up the chimney, which was proper and necessary, but much of it went down through the gaps in his puncheon floor, pulled by the endless convection currents that draft-prone construction created. Cold air infiltrated from below, heated air escaped in all directions, and the cycle continued as long as fuel lasted. The stove wasn't heating the cabin, it was heating the outdoors, with the cabin serving as an inefficient middleman in the process. Lars's system worked on different principles entirely. When he explained it to Ephraim Cole, who'd been studying the construction with the intense focus of a man whose own cabin was rapidly becoming uninhabitable, he kept the explanation simple. A stove can't fight wind under the boards. The double floor eliminated the wind under the boards. Everything else followed from that basic reality. To demonstrate, Lars had Ephraim hold his hand near the floor in different parts of the cabin. Near the sealed planks of the double floor system, the air was still, not stagnant, but not moving in the constant drafts that characterized most frontier construction. The heat from the stove settled and stayed, instead of being pulled away by infiltration patterns that most builders accepted as inevitable. The proof was measurable in ways that mattered to families trying to survive. Mrs. Anderson, whose own cabin had become so cold that ice formed on the water bucket despite constant firing, found she could work comfortably at Lars's table without shivering. Her children played on the floor without the thick quilts and extra stockings that frontier mothers learned to insist on during cold weather. Most tellingly, the adults could sit in chairs placed anywhere in the room, not just in the narrow zone of comfort immediately surrounding the stove. But the real test came in fuel consumption, where the difference between the two systems showed up in the arithmetic of survival. While abandoned cabins throughout the settlement burned through their winter wood supplies at emergency rates just to maintain barely livable conditions, Lars's stove required feeding every 60 to 90 minutes to maintain genuine comfort for a dozen people. The same BTU input produced dramatically different results because the building wasn't fighting the heating system with every gap and crack. Young Ephraim Cole understood the implications better than anyone because his own firewood supply was the thinnest in the settlement. He'd spent the previous summer clearing land and building instead of cutting and splitting the 4 to 5 cords that experienced settlers knew they'd need for a harsh Dakota winter. His pile might last through January if he burned judiciously, but it wouldn't survive the kind of constant firing that standard cabin construction demanded during prolonged cold spells. "How much wood are you burning?" Ephraim asked Lars during the third night of the storm, when the wind had finally begun to ease but the temperature remained locked at 35 below zero. The question carried weight because everyone in the crowded cabin was calculating their own supplies and wondering whether they'd make it through to spring burning at the rates the storm had demanded. Lars considered the question with the precision of a man who'd learned to measure fuel consumption the way a ship's captain measures water stores. "Maybe 25–30% less than normal for this cold," he estimated. "The heat stays put instead of running away through the floor." For families burning through a month's supply of firewood in a week just to keep children's fingers from freezing, that difference represented the margin between making it through the winter and facing impossible choices about what to burn when the cordwood ran out. The social dynamics inside the crowded cabin revealed how quickly mockery could turn to apprenticeship when survival was on the line. The same men who'd laughed at Lars's double floor construction in November were now asking detailed questions about sleeper spacing, fill materials, and perimeter ceiling techniques. Caleb Harlan, whose criticism had been the loudest and most persistent, spent hours examining the floor construction with the focused attention of a man, planning immediate modifications to his own cabin. "What thickness did you use for the sleepers? How deep did you make the cavities? Where'd you get sawdust that fine? How do you stop the air from getting around the edges? The questions came in a steady stream from men who dismissed the method as foreign eccentricity, but now recognized it as documented technique that produced measurable results under the worst conditions they'd ever experienced. Mrs. Schmidt, whose husband was already planning to tear up their puncheon floor as soon as the weather permitted, asked Inga Nielsen about the practical aspects of living with the double floor system. Was it sturdy enough for furniture? Did it creak or settle? How did you clean it? Did mice find ways into the sawdust? The women's questions focused on the daily realities of housekeeping and maintenance, but they came from the same recognition that had driven their husbands' technical inquiries. This wasn't just different construction, it was better construction for the conditions they actually faced. As the storm finally began to break on the fourth day, with wind dropping to merely strong instead of vicious and snow changing from horizontal driving sheets to ordinary heavy fall, the families began the process of returning to their own cabins to assess damage and plan repairs. But the conversations that started in Lars's crowded cabin would continue through the rest of the winter, spreading from family to family as word got out about the Norwegian's floor that had kept a dozen people comfortable during the worst blizzard in living memory. The mockery was over. The education was just beginning. And before spring arrived, the neighborhood's approach to floor construction would be fundamentally changed by 3 days of weather that had tested every assumption about adequate versus sufficient preparation for conditions that could kill the unprepared and reward those who understood what frontier building really demanded when nature turned serious about cold. Spring arrived late in 1889, but when it finally came, it brought with it the sound of hammering that echoed across the settlement from dawn to dusk. The lessons of the children's blizzard had settled deep into the community's understanding of what frontier construction actually demanded, and the first major home improvement after roof repairs and wall chinking wasn't decorative trim or expanded rooms, it was floors built to keep heat where families could use it. Caleb Harlan began his conversion in late March, as soon as the frost was out of the ground enough to make crawling under his cabin bearable. He'd spent the entire winter calculating and recalculating the fuel savings he'd witnessed in Lars's cabin, and the arithmetic was compelling enough to justify tearing up perfectly serviceable puncheon flooring to install something that actually worked. The job took him 2 weeks of evenings and Sundays laying sleepers and filling cavities with the finest sawdust Muller's mill could provide, but the result was a floor that cut his firewood consumption by a third while keeping his family comfortable down to their toes. Young Ephraim Cole started his double floor project even before Caleb finished his, working with the desperate efficiency of a man who'd burned through most of his winter wood supply during the blizzard and couldn't face another season of inadequate preparation. His pregnant wife had suffered through too many cold nights with numb feet and chattering teeth, and the prospect of trying to keep a newborn warm in a cabin that bled heat through every gap in the floor drove him to invest his spring cash in sleepers, sawdust, and tight-fitted top planks instead of the farm equipment he'd originally planned to buy. The Andersons took a different approach, hiring Lars directly to supervise their floor reconstruction and paying him in split rails and corn rather than cash money. Mrs. Anderson had decided that any construction technique that could keep 12 people comfortable during a 3-day killer storm was worth copying exactly, down to the specific measurements and materials that had proven themselves under the worst conditions anyone could remember. She wanted no shortcuts, no substitutions, and no modifications that might compromise the system's effectiveness. By midsummer, the double floor method had spread beyond the immediate neighborhood to families who'd only heard secondhand accounts of the blizzard's lessons. The technique carried practical credibility that overcame the usual frontier resistance to foreign building methods, partly because the results were measurable in ways that mattered to household budgets. A floor system that cut fuel consumption by 25 to 35% paid for itself in saved firewood within a single hard winter, and every family knew that more hard winters were coming. The local building practice evolved to accommodate different economic circumstances and available materials. Families with access to mill sawdust used it as Lars had, but others discovered that clean wheat chaff, dried grass clippings, and even shredded bark could serve the same insulating function if properly prepared and installed. The key principles remained consistent. Trap still air, seal the perimeter, create multiple barriers that forced cold to work harder to reach the living space above. More sophisticated builders began incorporating variations that improved on the basic system. Some installed vapor barriers using oiled paper or canvas to prevent moisture problems in the fill material. Others experimented with different sleeper spacings and depths to optimize the balance between material costs and thermal performance. A few ambitious families built triple-layer systems with 2 insulated cavities, though most agreed that the additional complexity wasn't worth the marginal improvement in comfort. The method gained formal recognition when the territorial government's Agricultural Extension Service included double-floor construction in their recommended building practices for new homesteaders. The publication described the technique as pugging and deafening applied to floor assemblies, connecting it to documented historical building practices that had been used in colder climates for generations. The official endorsement helped overcome lingering skepticism about foreign building methods and established the insulated floor as accepted frontier technology rather than immigrant eccentricity. Old Olaberg lived long enough to see his traditional carpentry knowledge become the standard approach to floor construction across 3 counties of Dakota Territory. He spent his final years traveling from job to job, teaching the proper installation techniques to younger builders who'd grown up assuming that drafty puncheon floors were simply the price of frontier living. His instruction focused on the details that separated successful installations from expensive failures: how to select and prepare fill materials, how to seal perimeter gaps that could compromise the entire system, and how to create durable assemblies that would maintain their performance for decades. The regional lumber industry adapted to support the new construction standard, with mills advertising specific grades of sleeper stock and offering prepared insulation materials for builders who couldn't source their own sawdust. Prices dropped as demand increased, making double-floor construction affordable for families who'd previously assumed that superior heating efficiency was a luxury they couldn't afford. But the most important validation came from the simple practical reality that families who'd installed the double-floor system reported measurably improved comfort and significantly reduced fuel costs through every subsequent winter. The technique worked not because it was modern or sophisticated, but because it addressed the fundamental physics of how buildings lost heat in ways that traditional frontier construction had never properly controlled. By 1895, a visitor to the region would have found it difficult to locate a cabin built with single-layer puncheon flooring. The children's blizzard had become the reference point that justified any amount of extra work on thermal efficiency. And January 12, 1888 remained the date that settlers invoked whenever someone questioned whether additional preparation was really necessary for conditions that might never come again. The lesson had settled into the collective wisdom of frontier building. That preparation, which looked wasteful on a mild day, became the difference between survival and death when weather turned serious. That understanding what separated adequate from sufficient could mean the difference between families who made it through hard winters in comfort and families who spent months fighting a losing battle against cold that their buildings couldn't control, and that sometimes the most important innovations weren't new technologies or modern improvements, but old techniques applied to new problems by people who understood that the margin between success and failure on the frontier was often measured in degrees, literally, and in the wisdom to prepare for conditions that optimists hoped would never come, but that experience taught certainly would. The double floor had become more than a construction technique. It had become proof that traditional knowledge, properly applied, could turn the difference between mockery and respect, between adequate and right, between surviving winter and being comfortable enough to thrive through it. And in a place where winter lasted 6 months and could kill the unprepared, that difference was worth every nail, every board, and every shovelful of sawdust that had seemed like such a waste when the weather was mild and the future looked manageable.